Hey there, welcome to Night Lectures, your daily dose of fascinating stories. Everest, the summit thousands dream of. But what truly hides behind this dream? In this video, you will learn not only how Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay first reached the top of the world, but also about those who climbed it alone and without oxygen. We will tell the stories of why, today, queues of hundreds of people form on Everest, how mountains of garbage appear directly on the glaciers, and what happens when someone in the death zone needs help, yet there is no strength left nearby to save them. You will hear stories of records and tragedies, of rescue operations, of moral choices between the summit and a human life. You will see why Everest remains not just a mountain, but a place that shows every person what drives them forward, and where their own limit lies. Share your ideas for future videos in the comments and hit the subscribe button. New bedtime stories come out here daily. The mountain we now call Everest, known for centuries to local peoples as Chomolungma or Sagarmatha, long before appearing on European maps already lived in the human imagination as an exceptional place, a realm where heaven and earth, mortals and the unknown, touched. For centuries it towered above the valleys and high plateaus of the Himalayas, so high that on clear days its glittering icy slopes could be seen from dozens of kilometers away, reminding people of powers they could only revere but never command. To the Tibetans, it was Chomolungma, the divine mother of the earth. This name was not mere poetry, it expressed reverence and the awareness of its sacred status. In monasteries along the slopes and valleys, monks told legends of guardian spirits dwelling on the summit, preserving the order of the world and of the storms, avalanches, or icy deaths awaiting anyone who dared disturb their peace. The Sherpa people, who had lived for generations at the foot of Everest, believed the summit to be forbidden. No herds were driven there, no one ascended without dire need, for it was not merely a mountain, but the dwelling of gods and ancestral spirits. Even before the name Everest appeared in scientific literature, Europeans who had reached those lands, most of them merchants or Buddhist pilgrims, told nearly the same story. In the far north, there was a mountain so high its summit vanished into the clouds, and those who tried to reach it often never returned. The locals did not measure height as we do today, but they had their own scale. The mountain was considered the highest simply because, on a clear morning, it appeared first on the horizon, and its shadow stretched farther than all others. In the middle of the 19th century, when the British Empire was actively surveying India, geographic societies began to wonder where the highest point on the planet truly lay. It was then, as part of the famous Great Trigonometrical Survey of India, begun in the year 1802, that British surveyors first turned their attention to that very mountain the locals called Chomolungma. In British documents, it initially appeared under the technical designation Peak 15, used in the measurement system based on theodolites and long-distance rangefinders carried through impenetrable jungles and mountain passes. The story of measuring Everest's height deserves special mention. In the year 1852, an Indian mathematician named Radhanath Sikdar, working within the Bengal Trigonometrical Survey, after long calculations concluded that Peak 15 was likely the highest point on Earth. After repeated verifications, in the year 1856 the result was officially published. The new summit's height was recorded as 29,002 feet, or 8,839 meters. Modern data slightly refines that figure. Today, the officially recognized height is 8,848.86 meters, established jointly by Nepal and China in the year 2020. But for the 19th century, such a difference was insignificant. It was at that time that the mountain received its modern name, in honor of Colonel Sir George Everest, former Surveyor General of India. Ironically, George Everest himself had never seen the mountain and objected to naming it after him, insisting that it already had a local name. Yet the decision was made in London, not in the Himalayas. From that moment on, Everest entered scientific works and school atlases, but for the locals, it remained Chomolungma, the sacred summit approached with awe and fear. Interestingly, even after Everest was recognized as the world's highest mountain, Europeans did not immediately attempt to climb it. Tibet was closed to foreigners, and there were no precise maps or routes. Reaching the foot of Everest was far more difficult than ascending Mont Blanc or the Matterhorn. Gradually, in the early 20th century, a new attitude toward mountains took shape among Western alpinists. Mountains were no longer obstacles but challenges, a field to test will, courage, and ingenuity. In the alpine clubs of London, Paris, Bern, and Geneva, climbers debated whether reaching such heights was even possible, for medical science at the time poorly understood how thin air affected the human body. Some specialists seriously claimed that above 7,000 meters a person could not survive without severe health consequences. During those years came reports of ascents of other, lower Himalayan peaks, such as Kanchenjunga and Annapurna, and ever more often, eyes turned toward Everest. One of those who contributed greatly to this fascination was John Knoll, a British photographer and traveler who had reached the borders of Tibet in the early 1920s. He brought back to London the first film footage and photographs of Everest, shown in large halls and leaving audiences astonished. Thousands of people saw for the first time the summit they had only heard about. And then the same question began to echo everywhere. If such a mountain exists, if it is so vast and beautiful, can a human being truly stand upon its summit? But for the Tibetans and Sherpas themselves, the question was different. For them, the mountain remained sacred, and the arrival of the first foreign expeditions brought not admiration, but caution and fear. Chronicles from Tibetan monasteries mention that in the early 20th century, rumors reached Lhasa about white men heading north with unknown purpose, and councils of lamas were held to decide whether to allow them near Chomolungma. One record tells that a prayer was read, asking the mountain spirits to protect the summit from intrusion. These sentiments, interwoven with political and religious concerns, long hindered Western alpinists from approaching Everest. Until the early 1920s, the path to its foot remained closed to almost all who were not native to the region. When at the dawn of the 20th century European explorers turned their attention ever more to the Himalayas, and the name Everest had already entered geographical reference books, the idea of trying to climb it began to seem less an impossible dream and more a concrete plan, even though the northern slopes remained off limits to foreigners due to Tibet's isolationist policy. In the year 1921, Great Britain finally obtained official permission from the Tibetan authorities to conduct the first reconnaissance expedition. Its purpose was not to reach the summit, but to study possible climbing routes, perform detailed topographical surveys, and determine whether ascent was feasible at all, technically and logistically. The expedition was led by Colonel Charles Howard Berry, but its central figure became George Mallory, a history teacher from Cambridge and a mountaineer already renowned for his alpine climbs and his deep passion for mountains. Mallory differed from many contemporaries in that he saw mountains not merely as a sport, but as a kind of philosophical quest. Born in England, educated at Winchester College, and later at Cambridge, interested in art and literature, he always returned to the mountains, believing they were a place where a person could test themselves and approach something greater. His now famous answer to a journalist who asked, "Why do you want to climb Everest?" "Because it exists," became a symbol of the entire mountaineering spirit of that era. The first reconnaissance expedition of 1921 crossed the northern regions of Tibet and reached the Rongbuk Glacier. There, the British first described the route through the North Ridge and the East Rongbuk Glacier, which would later become the classic path for climbs from the Tibetan side. The participants reached a height of about 7,000 meters, a record for the time, considering the lack of oxygen equipment and experience at such altitude. The main result was a series of detailed maps and the realization that a route to the summit was indeed possible. Already the following year, in 1922, came the second British expedition, the first officially aimed at reaching the summit of Everest. George Mallory again took part, along with Edward Norton and other noted climbers of the era. This expedition made history as the first to use supplemental oxygen, heavy and unreliable metal cylinders with primitive regulators, yet already indispensable above 8,000 meters. During this attempt, the climbers reached a height of about 8,320 meters, an absolute record at the time, but failed to reach the summit. On the slopes of the North Ridge, tragedy struck. An avalanche killed 7 Sherpas who accompanied the British team. It became the first major disaster in the history of Everest expeditions and caused a strong public reaction in Britain. Newspapers debated the morality of such risks, yet despite the losses, the determination to continue remained. The third British expedition set out in 1924, the most famous of all, and with it came one of the greatest mysteries in mountaineering history. George Mallory returned, this time partnered with 22-year-old Andrew Irvine, an Oxford student with an engineering background responsible for the expedition's oxygen systems. The team established base on the Rongbuk Glacier, employing the classic step-by-step method of establishing intermediate camps. The base camp lay at about 5,200 meters. Higher camps were set at 6,400, 7,000, and roughly 7,500 meters. This staged approach, first used by the British, became the model for all future high-altitude expeditions. The most dramatic moment came on the 8th of June, 1924. That day, Mallory and Irvine left their last camp at around 8,170 meters and began their final push for the summit. The last person to see them alive was geologist Noel Odell, who, from a lower camp, watched them through binoculars. He reported seeing two figures ascending toward the second step of the North Ridge at about 8,600 meters. After that, contact was lost. The weather deteriorated quickly. Snow thickened, winds rose, and all efforts to locate them failed. Search parties ascended but found no trace of the climbers or their camp. Mallory and Irvine vanished into Everest's heights, leaving behind one of the 20th century's most debated questions. Did they reach the summit or not? The mystery endured for more than 70 years. In 1999, an American search expedition led by Conrad Anker discovered George Mallory's body at about 8,155 meters. It was partly covered by stones and snow, but his clothing, boots, and some gear remained intact. Researchers searched carefully for the camera Mallory might have carried to photograph the summit, but neither camera nor notes were found. Examination showed injuries consistent with a fall, suggesting he died from slipping off a steep slope. A curious detail, he no longer had with him the photograph of his wife, Ruth, which he had promised to leave on the summit if successful. This absence reignited speculation that he might indeed have reached the top. Though the British expeditions of the 1920s never officially conquered Everest, they paved the way for all who came after. The methods of setting camps, using oxygen, preparing routes, and above all, the spirit of striving for the impossible were born then, with the names of George Mallory and Andrew Irvine forever remembered among the first heroes of Everest. After the three British expeditions of the 1920s, all through the following decades, the northern route via Tibet remained the only viable path for climbers, since the geopolitical situation made other approaches impossible. The southern side of Everest, lying in Nepal, stayed closed for a long time due to the internal policies of that mountainous kingdom. But in the second half of the 20th century, after the end of the Second World War, sweeping political changes across Asia reshaped the fate of Everest. In the year 1950, China established control over Tibet, and by 1951, all foreign access to Tibetan territory, including Everest's northern slopes, was forbidden. This ended the history of British climbs from the north and forced the international mountaineering community to search for new routes to the world's highest point. At the same time, Nepal was undergoing internal transformation. After the fall of the Rana regime and the beginning of democratic reforms in 1951, the country opened its borders to foreigners for the first time in decades, allowing diplomatic, scientific, and sporting expeditions. This marked a turning point in Everest's history, for the mountain's southern flank was now open. The first expedition to explore this new route was a British reconnaissance team led by Eric Shipton in 1951. Their goal was not to reach the summit, but to map the terrain and determine whether passage through the Khumbu Glacier and South Col was feasible. The team surveyed the Khumbu Valley, documented the Khumbu icefall, and described the glacial fields, unknown to the Western world until then. Among the team was a young Sherpa named Tenzing Norgay. Already experienced from previous Himalayan expeditions, he proved himself one of the most reliable and resilient high-altitude guides, helping the British cross crevasses and dangerous sections of ice. Opening Nepal not only offered new routes, but changed the very nature of mountaineering expeditions. Formerly, climbs were state-sponsored scientific ventures. Now began an era of international teams, with Sherpas as indispensable members of every group. A key step confirming the southern route's viability was the Swiss expedition of 1952, led by Edouard Wyss-Dunant. It was the first in history to attempt Everest from Nepal. Advancing through the Khumbu icefall and over the South Col at roughly 8,000 meters, the team reached a record height of 8,195 meters along the southeast ridge. Bad weather and exhaustion forced them back, but their achievement proved the route possible despite avalanches, crevasses, and the need for multiple camps. Tenzing Norgay, who took part, emerged as one of the leading Sherpas, known not only for endurance but for technical skill. After 1952, his name began appearing frequently in international reports on Himalayan climbing. As Nepal opened to the world, the region's life began to change. In the Khumbu Valley appeared the first guest houses and equipment stores. Small hospitals and schools were built with international aid, and construction began on the airport at Lukla, which would become the main gateway for all Everest expeditions. By early 1953, the global mountaineering community was convinced the road to the top of the world now lay through Nepal. The British, drawing on decades of experience in Swiss findings, prepared once again to reach the summit. Thus, the post-war political shifts, Tibet's closure and Nepal's opening, reshaped the entire history of Everest, defining the route that, to this very day, remains the principal path for nearly all climbers who dream of standing atop the highest mountain on Earth. By the beginning of 1953, the route to Everest from the Nepalese side had been thoroughly explored and officially recognized by the international mountaineering community as the main and most promising path toward the highest point on the planet. It was along this route that, in March of that year, a British expedition set out, officially organized to achieve what had remained unattained since the days of Mallory and Irvine. That expedition, led by Sir John Hunt, would go down in history as the first to reach the summit of Everest successfully. John Hunt was not only an officer of the British Army, but also a man with extensive experience organizing complex expeditions, which allowed him to calculate logistics precisely, distribute responsibilities, and build tactics so that every detail served the common goal. The team included 20 climbers, among them Charles Evans, Tom Bourdillon, George Lowe, the New Zealander Edmund Hillary, and the Sherpa Tenzing Norgay. In addition, there were 362 porters and more than 20 highly qualified Sherpas, without whom progress on the route would have been impossible. The path ran from Lukla through the Khumbu Valley, along the Khumbu Icefall, and onward through the South Col. Special attention was paid to the treacherous icefall, where ladders and rope railings had to be set and checked daily, for the structure of the frozen masses changed literally every day under sunlight and glacial movement. A system of intermediate camps was arranged by a tested principle. The base camp stood at about 5,400 meters. Camps the first 2 and 3 were at 6,000, 6,400, and 7,000 meters. Above them followed camps 4, 5, 6, and up to the assault camp 9 on the South Col and beyond. The first serious attempt on the summit came on the 26th of May 1953 by Charles Evans and Tom Bourdillon. Using oxygen apparatus, they reached roughly 8,750 meters, only 100 meters below the top. But problems with oxygen and exhaustion forced their retreat. Hunt later called that decision a mark of cool judgment and professionalism. In mountaineering, he said, success means not only to climb up, but also to return alive. The second and final attempt took place on the 29th of May, 1953. That morning, Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay left the assault camp around 6:30 and began their ascent. The weather was relatively stable, light wind, temperature about -20 degrees Celsius. They advanced along the southeast ridge, overcoming snow-covered slopes until they reached the route's most technical obstacle, the section that would later be named the Hillary Step, an almost vertical 12-meter rock and ice wall. With an ice axe, crampons, and rope, Hillary hauled himself up and secured the line so Norgay could follow. From there, they pressed on. According to Hillary's recollections, the final meters were the most exhausting because of the thin air, but around 11:30 in the morning, on that 29th of May, both men stood upon the summit of Everest. They spent about 15 minutes there, taking photographs. Hillary left a small silver cross given by another team member, and Tenzing, following Buddhist tradition, placed in the snow a bit of chocolate and a tiny image of the Buddha. Later, during the descent, Hillary uttered the phrase that became classic in mountaineering, "We knocked the bastard off." Yet he always emphasized that what mattered most was not standing on the summit, but returning safely. They reached Camp 9 that same evening, and news of the success quickly spread through the expedition. The official telegram to London was released on the 2nd of June 1953, the very day of Queen Elizabeth II's coronation, turning it into a double celebration for Britain. Hunt's expedition became a model of precise organization and teamwork. Oxygen equipment, staged camps, route preparation, and Sherpas serving as full members of summit parties all became standards for future climbs. The story of Hillary and Norgay did not end with their return. Both were awarded the highest honors. Edmund Hillary was knighted, while Tenzing Norgay became a national hero of Nepal and India. Yet Hillary considered his real achievement to be humanitarian. In later years, he devoted himself to helping the Himalayan people, building schools, bridges, and clinics in the Khumbu Valley. Thus, the 29th of May, 1953, marked the culmination of decades of effort that had begun back in the 1920s. From that day onward, the summit of the world ceased to be an unattainable symbol and became a place toward which people from all nations would now aspire. After the 1953 ascent of Edmund, Hillary, and Tenzing Norgay, the flow of expeditions to Everest steadily grew. Yet it soon became clear that, despite new opportunities, the mountain itself had not become less dangerous. Every climb remained not only a triumph of will, but also a gamble with death, for Everest was a realm where even the most meticulous planning could never eliminate chance, and each step demanded complete focus and readiness for the unforeseen. From the early 1960s, expeditions multiplied, from Japan, India, Switzerland, the United States, and elsewhere. Accidents followed: avalanches, sudden storms, the onset of altitude sickness. One tragedy occurred in 1962 when members of an Indian team, caught by bad weather on the South Pole, died from exhaustion and hypoxia. That incident provoked public debate in India and introduced a new term to the wider world: the death zone, meaning altitudes above 8,000 meters where the human body begins to deteriorate from oxygen deprivation, and remaining there for more than a few hours can prove fatal. Altitude sickness, hypoxia, manifests differently in everyone. For some, it starts with headaches and insomnia. For others, it escalates into pulmonary or cerebral edema, causing slurred speech, loss of coordination, hallucinations, even coma. During the 1960s, climbers began to understand this fully. The era of oxygen-assisted climbs began. Most teams now carried cylinders to lessen risk. Yet even with such gear, in the death zone, any mistake could cost a life. Among the darkest episodes came in May 1996, when a sudden storm killed several members of commercial expeditions. One of them was Yasuko Namba, a Japanese mountaineer who had just become the oldest woman ever to reach the summit. Her story became emblematic of both courage and human frailty at altitude. After summiting, she and others were trapped in the storm, unable to descend. They spent the night exposed in the death zone. Several, including Namba, died from cold and exhaustion. These events were later recounted in Jon Krakauer's Into Thin Air and dramatized in the film Everest, but countless lesser-known tragedies have marked the decades. Avalanches remained one of Everest's chief threats, especially in the Khumbu icefall, a maze of ice towers and crevasses. One of the worst modern disasters occurred on the 18th of April 2014, when 16 Sherpas died while ferrying loads for commercial teams. The catastrophe provoked global outrage and open debate on the working conditions and social protection of Sherpas, without whom no expedition could succeed. Families of the dead received compensation, yet the question of fairness in how Everest's wealth is shared remains unresolved. The story of Rob Hall, a New Zealand mountaineer and leader of commercial climbs, also stands as a symbol of self-sacrifice. During the same 1996 storm, Hall refused to abandon his client Doug Hansen, who was too weak to continue. He stayed with him until the end, keeping radio contact with the base camp. His final words, spoken to his wife and colleagues, became immortal in mountaineering lore, a testament to loyalty and humanity even in mortal peril. Another grim reality of Everest is that the bodies of those who die often remain where they fall. Recovery from above 8,000 meters is perilous and rarely attempted. One well-known example is that of Indian climber Tsewang Paljor, who perished in 1996. His remains, marked by the distinctive green boots, served for more than a decade as a grim landmark on the northern route, a reminder of the cost of ambition. Contrary to popular belief, the saying, "everyone is responsible only for themselves," is not an official rule. Yet in the death zone, it becomes the hard reality. Above 8,000 meters, even the strongest rescuers may have to turn back rather than risk their own lives. Still, in rare cases, rescue succeeds, as in 2019, when a team of Nepalese Sherpas, using specialized gear, evacuated a climber alive from about 8,500 meters. It was an exception that proved hope can survive even there. Thus, Everest remains a place where two forces intertwine: the human drive to rise above all, and the inevitable shadow of those who never returned. Each ascent retells the same story: struggle, risk, sometimes victory, sometimes remembrance. When Everest was first conquered in 1953, mountaineering still viewed high-altitude climbing as a male domain. Few women took part in expeditions, and fewer still led them. But from the mid-1960s onward, more women set out to prove that physical and mental endurance at 8,000-meter heights was no less within their reach. The first woman ever to stand atop Everest was the Japanese climber Junko Tabei. It happened on the 16th of May, 1975, during a specially organized Japanese women's expedition. Tibet, already a respected leader within Japan's mountaineering circles and veteran of climbs on the Matterhorn, Mont Blanc, and Denali, led a 15-member female team supported by 16 Sherpas. Preparing such an expedition required enormous effort, funding, Nepalese permits, logistics, at a time when women's mountaineering projects in Japan were still met with skepticism. During acclimatization, disaster struck. On the 4th of May, an avalanche swept through one of the camps, burying several tents and Junko Tabei herself. Thanks to the swift reaction of Sherpas and teammates, she was pulled out alive. Bruised but determined, she chose to continue. On the 16th of May 1975, after days of preparation and partial attempts, Tabei and the Sherpa Angchering reached the summit. They stayed about 15 minutes, taking photos and leaving small tokens as is custom. For Tabei, the real meaning lay not in personal glory, but in proving that women could achieve the same feats of endurance and cooperation as men. Her success made her world famous. She later became the first woman to complete the 7 Summits Challenge, the highest peaks of each continent. Even in later life, she continued climbing and promoting women's mountaineering in Japan. Another landmark name was the Polish climber Wanda Rutkiewicz, who reached the top on the 16th of October 1978. She became not only the first European woman on Everest, but also one of the earliest to climb with minimal supplemental oxygen. Born in Lviv and later living in Poland, Rutkiewicz was both engineer and athlete, known for seeking technically demanding routes rather than commercial ones. After Everest, she scaled Kanchenjunga, Nanga Parbat, and other Himalayan giants. In 1992, she disappeared on Kanchenjunga. Her body was never found. Equally symbolic was Pasang Lhamu Sherpa, who on the 22nd of April 1993 became the first Nepalese woman to reach the summit officially. In a country where female participation in such ventures had long been constrained by tradition, her success was historic. Tragically, she died in an avalanche during descent. A statue in Kathmandu honors her memory, and her name has inspired generations of Nepalese women climbers. Today, women's presence on Everest has become ordinary. They serve as climbers, leaders, and guides within international teams. In Nepal, specialized mountaineering schools for women have appeared, and organizations like the Himalayan Women's Foundation support training for future athletes. All this owes to those pioneers who proved that altitude draws no line between men and women, only between the willing and the unwilling, the enduring and the resigned. After Everest was first conquered in 1953, the ascent itself ceased to be viewed as absolutely unattainable. Yet for many climbers, the real challenge lay in how to reach the top, without supplemental oxygen, in the heart of winter, or entirely alone, without support or a team. Attempts of precisely this kind gradually defined a new stage in the history of high-altitude mountaineering. One of the first to prove that Everest could be reached without oxygen was Reinhold Messner of South Tyrol, whose name became world famous after his May ascent in 1978, together with the Austrian Peter Habeler. Until then, it was widely believed that above 8,000 meters the human body could not function for long without supplemental oxygen. Messner and Habeler set out to prove the opposite. Moving by the classic southern route with minimal gear in the lightest possible style, they reached the summit on the 8th of May, 1978. Messner later recalled that over the final dozens of meters he moved as if in a dream, barely sensing the world around him, guided by a single thought: to take the next step. The ascent became a true turning point for the mountaineering world, showing that the limits of the human body were far wider than previously assumed. In August of 1980, Messner accomplished an even more extreme feat, the first solo ascent of Everest in history, without oxygen and without any supporting team. He climbed by the northern route, leaving base camp on the 18th of August and reaching the summit on the 20th, completing the route in a fully autonomous style. The climb took 3 days. Throughout that time, he was entirely alone, relying only on his own strength and experience. Messner would write later that it was the hardest ordeal of his life. Cold, sleeplessness, thin air, and the constant sensation of absolute isolation made every step almost impossible. Another vector of extremity was winter climbing. The first winter ascent of Everest was achieved by a Polish team led by Andrzej Zawada. On the 17th of February 1980, Krzysztof Wilicki and Leszek Cici stood on the summit in conditions where the air temperature fell below minus 40 degrees Celsius and winds exceeded 160 kilometers per hour. They climbed by the southern route, and the expedition itself lasted several weeks. Camps were established amid continual hurricane-force winds, and the route had to be rebroken again and again as the structure of ice and snow shifted. Their success was a sensation, for winter ascents of 8,000ers had been considered nearly impossible. It was the Polish school that first established winter Himalayanism as a distinct discipline. Krzysztof Wieliczki later became one of its most renowned representatives, taking part in winter attempts on other 8,000ers, including Kanchenjunga and K2. His name, like that of Leszek Cici, entered not only Polish but world mountaineering history, and Polish teams cemented a reputation as true specialists in Himalayan winters. A special place in Everest's story also belongs to the Bulgarian climber Valentin Božkov, who in 1984 became the first Bulgarian to reach the summit. His ascent took place within a national Bulgarian expedition organized with limited resources at a time when the socialist countries of Eastern Europe were only beginning to take active part in Himalayan climbing. Božkov climbed by the classic southern route using oxygen, yet the very organization of such an expedition and its success proved significant for Bulgaria, where Himalayan mountaineering had developed slowly and with difficulty. After his ascent, Božkov continued to promote the sport, training new climbers and popularizing mountaineering in Bulgaria. Thus, from the late 1970s to the present day, Everest has served not only as a stage for traditional commercial ascents, but as a proving ground for human potential in its most extreme forms, without oxygen, alone, and in winter. Such climbs require not only strength or technology, but inner resolve, the ability to endure solitude and to keep moving where every tool seems powerless. When in 1953 Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay first reached the top of Everest, an ascent was still a rare and extraordinary event, accessible only to carefully prepared climbers within national expeditions. By the end of the 20th century, however, things had changed. Commercial companies offering guided ascents for a set fee transformed the climb from a unique achievement into a purchasable service for those able to pay for logistical organization, equipment rental, and professional guides. By the beginning of the 21st century, commercialization had advanced to the point that in May, during the optimal weather window, hundreds of people could be on Everest slopes at the same time, seasoned alpinists alongside clients of commercial teams with minimal experience. In base camp, at roughly 5,364 meters, an infrastructure resembling a temporary city sprang up. Tents, kitchens, medical posts, satellite stations, even improvised cafes. One of the most discussed examples of mass traffic came in the spring of 2019, when during a single week, more than 200 people were simultaneously on the southern route via the South Col and the Southeast Ridge. Nirmal Purja's photograph of the long queue of climbers waiting for their turn on the final section circled the world and became a symbol of Everest's modern contradictions. With the growth in numbers came a sharp rise in environmental pressure. Above base camp, tons of trash accumulate, spent oxygen cylinders, empty packaging, abandoned gear, and human waste that hardly decomposes in permafrost. Organized cleanup expeditions began already in the 2000s, but since 2014, such operations have become a formal requirement for commercial teams. Under the official program, every participant must bring down at least 8 kilograms of waste, including personal refuse. That same 2014, Nepalese authorities began actively regulating commercial activity on Everest, instituting additional fees, licenses, and rules. For foreigners in a commercial group, the cost of an ascent starts around 30 to 40,000 United States dollars and can reach 120,000, depending on the level of service, number of oxygen cylinders, equipment, and individualized support. These sums cover the work of guides and Sherpas, the establishment of camps, and the provision of food and medical care. At the heart of this industry stands the work of Sherpas, high-altitude guides and porters without whom most expeditions would be impossible. Sherpas set the ladders and fixed lines in the Khumbu icefall, transport oxygen and gear to intermediate camps, and often make early summit pushes as part of support teams to prepare the route for clients. Sherpa stories have become an integral part of the mountain. The most famous in the 21st century is Kami Rita Sherpa, who by May of 2023 had officially registered 28 successful Everest ascents, a world record. For Kami Rita and his colleagues, the mountain is a livelihood and a way of life, one bound to risk, since even with modern equipment climbers face avalanches, collapsing seracs, and sudden weather shifts. A particularly acute problem is the rising number of clients with insufficient physical and technical preparation. Guides are increasingly forced to help not only with safety systems, but even with putting on crampons or managing oxygen equipment. Such situations increase the burden on teams and heighten accident risk, because in the death zone above 8,000 meters rescue is rarely possible and demands full self-reliance. Additional difficulties arise from the crowding of people and machinery in base camp. In spring months, it becomes a temporary agglomeration of hundreds of tents, diesel generators, satellite dishes, and medical stations. In 2022, Nepalese authorities officially began discussing relocating base camp downslope to reduce pressure on the glacier beneath it, which is melting under climate change and further stressed by heavy equipment. No final decision has been made, but the debate is active among expedition operators. Thus, in the 21st century, Everest has become not only a symbol of high-altitude climbing, but an arena where sport, business, and ecology collide. On one hand, commercial expeditions allow thousands to realize a summit dream. On the other, mass traffic, pollution, and route congestion demand a new balance between access and responsibility toward the mountain and its unique ecosystem. When Everest was first conquered in 1953, reaching its summit was viewed as a rare and unique triumph. As the number of expeditions grew, however, questions emerged that concern not technique or stamina, but ethics, responsibility, and the consequences of mass human presence in one of the planet's most fragile environments. Chief among the debates are scenarios involving the refusal or inability to rescue climbers in distress at extreme altitude. In the death zone, that is, above 8,000 meters, the body cannot properly recover, and each additional step costs enormous physical and moral effort. Everest's history records many cases in which a dying climber remained on the slope while others continued upward. Particularly widely discussed was the case of the British climber David Sharp, who died in May of 2006 on the northern route, sheltering beside a rock at about 8,500 meters. According to various reports, dozens of climbers from multiple expeditions passed him, yet no group managed, or dared, to attempt a rescue amid severe oxygen shortages and the rescuer's own exhaustion. The story ignited international debate. Some argued that saving Sharp was impossible. Others asked why at least a rescue attempt was not made. Such episodes confront every climber with hard questions. How do sporting goals relate to human duty? Where lies the boundary between the necessity to continue and responsibility for another's life? Although decisions are individual, an unwritten ethical code is taking shape in the mountaineering world, placing support and mutual aid above records. Another unresolved issue is the presence of bodies that often remain on the route for years. Above 8,000 meters, recovery can pose risks equal to a new ascent. International practice recognizes that if a body lies too high and its removal would endanger rescuers, it remains in place. This leads to a further dilemma. Some bodies become landmarks, as with the remains of Indian climber Tsewang Paljor, known among climbers as Green Boots. In recent years, efforts have been made to conceal or remove such remains out of respect for the dead and to reduce the psychological burden on newcomers, yet a complete solution remains elusive. Increasingly, team leaders and guides make the decisive ethical calls. Cases in which groups abandon a summit bid to help a struggling member have become part of Everest's modern history. In 2017, for example, the Sherpa Pasangtamang gave up his push and descended with a client showing severe signs of altitude illness. Both survived, and stories like these are reshaping priorities. Not every summit is worth leaving someone behind. Thus, in the 21st century, Everest remains not only the planet's highest mountain, but a space where endurance, ethics, ecology, and common sense intersect. Anyone heading for the top faces not only the technical task of the climb, but an inner choice, how to achieve it, and at what cost. When the path to Everest's summit has been trodden and the storm has passed, one question remains, a question every climber inevitably asks: what does this summit mean? Across nearly a century of attempts, Everest has become more than a geographic point. It is a symbol, a test not only of physical strength but of the structure of the human spirit. For some, it is the urge to prove that the boundaries of the possible can be crossed. For others, a way to become part of history. With each passing year, however, it grows clearer that the mountain reflects not only ambition, but weakness. Queues, litter, tragedies, the dilemmas of rescue, all of this has become part of modern Everest, showing that victory does not always equal transcendence. And yet, despite mass traffic and commercialization, Everest continues to draw people. In that pull lies something greater than a record, the wish to touch a realm where the world feels infinitely vast and a person infinitely small, and yet still capable of taking one more step. The calm that opens to the one who stands upon the summit, and the memory of those who remained along the way. These are Everest's abiding values for those who seek not only altitude, but an understanding of the scale of life and the eloquence of silence.